Hi, today we're with Bill Downing, cannabis educator and researcher and enthusiast for quite a long time, right?
That's right, political activist too, yeah.
And what can you tell us about MassCann?
Well, MassCann's been around since 1989, and I got involved the following year in 1990. And when I first got involved in MassCann, it was just a few people. It was a very small organization. And almost immediately I was elected president because we only had enough people to fill the titles of the organization. We didn't really have many members. Things slowly grew. It was very difficult back in the early 1990s to stand up and say that you supported cannabis law reform because there was so much stigma associated with marijuana use. After all, it was just at the end of the Reagan era with the Just Say No to Drugs big national themes, and there were, of course, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent every year by the federal government on anti-drug propaganda, which of course included anti-marijuana propaganda. So it was quite a struggle.
And what is the real truth about cannabis?
Well,
I know the answer,
there are
but
many,
I
many
want other
truths.
people to know the answer.
Right on. Yeah, there are many, many truths about cannabis. But you know, one of the most interesting things that I knew when I was very young, because of course a lot of this medical evidence about cannabis didn't come out until later on. But I found out at a very early age that cannabis intoxication is nothing like being drunk or being high on any variety of drugs. Cannabis intoxication is it's very, very different. It's really not as disorienting as most drugs are. It's not as disabling as most drugs are. It has very few side effects other than getting you high, really. And also, those early experiences I understood to be some of the most pleasant experiences in my life. Because the side effects of cannabis when used as a medicine are nominal. Certainly nothing when compared to pharmaceutical drugs. And it's virtually non-toxic. You really can't kill yourself with it. But as a medicine, it should be a first line of defense or offense for many, many issues. Here, this is a relatively large bag of cannabis. This one's called Lemon Kush. You can see the little label on there. Yeah. It's basically a bag full of buds, meaning female marijuana tops. And so this is what a typical bud looks like right there.
What is RSO?
RSO is basically the oil that's been extracted from cannabis. And it became called RSO because of a very famous guy who did a lot of interesting work with cannabis and cancer. And his name is Rick Simpson. So RSO stands for Rick Simpson Oil. And you can go to Rick Simpson's website and read all about his experiences with cannabis and cancer. Basically, he's found that for many people, cannabis has been able to bring their cancers to remission. With Rick Simpson and his formula on his website, he uses acetone, which I think is a very bad idea.
Yeah.
That's actually not nail polish remover and not a safe solvent at all.
The manicurists use those.
Though Rick Simpson is a great guy and he has some really great advice and he has a lot of people on his website with great advice about cancer and cannabis, his formula for making RSO should be abandoned, and hopefully many people have abandoned, because acetone is a nasty, nasty chemical.
What would be the best thing to use? Is that what they do for FICO?
FICO generally is alcohol extract. There's so many people love to coin new names and make new phrases for things, and FICO is just basically alcohol extract with a fancy new name. It's fully extracted cannabis oil. FICO. And they could have called it alcohol extract and been less mysterious about it, but people like to make things up, so what the heck, you know? And the idea of it, though, is an alcohol extract actually still has a lot of the original oils from the plant preserved in it.
Oh.
As opposed to certain other types of extraction where a lot of times things are destroyed. For instance, with butane honey oil, which is really nice stuff, the butane extraction process tends to destroy the terpenes in the oils. And there's some really good science. We'll talk about this more if you ask a question about it, about the entourage effect. But it's the idea that not only do the cannabinoids, various cannabinoids like THC and CBD and CBG and CBC and all those other ones, work together to produce the medical effects of cannabis, but that there's a whole nother set of chemicals called terpenes, which are the fragrant oils that volatilize at room temperature to make smells. Mm-hmm. So when you smell marijuana, like this lemon kush, that kind of a citrusy smell to it, that comes from a particular terpene called limonene.
Right.
And limonene is in lemon peel. So if you take a lemon peel and squish it and you see all these little droplets of oil coming off the peel, that's limonene. And yeah, there's some of that stuff in cannabis. But not just limonene, but also pinene, which is from various kinds of pines like juniper and rosemary and stuff like that. And linalool, which is from lavender. And myrcene, which is from hops, and on and on and on. There's a big long list of different terpenes that are found naturally in cannabis. And those are valuable too. They work together with the cannabinoids to produce the full medical effect of cannabis. And there's some really good science behind that.
What is CBD, and what is that good for?
Well,
if you just use CBD.
Sure. Let's look at this interesting chart here. I'll move my marijuana out of the way. So, this is a chart that was produced in 2012, so it's pretty old, but what it stipulates is still valid. I can tell you from my ongoing research. We have listed in these colored columns various cannabinoids, and cannabinoids, again, are chemicals that are, for the most part, unique to the cannabis plant. There are other plants that contain certain cannabinoids, but cannabis is the only one that has all of them. And that's what defines them as cannabinoids. There are well over 100 different cannabinoids, but these 8 here are 8 cannabinoids that occur in large enough quantities in normal cannabis that you would expect that they'd have some sort of medical effect. And the 2 big ones are THC and CBD. Most of the cannabinoid that's in cannabis is either THC or CBD. If it's got a lot of THC in it, then it is, by legal definition, marijuana. If it has very little THC in it, then it is, by definition, hemp. So that's the difference between hemp and marijuana. Hemp has no THC, but it has plenty of these other cannabinoids. Doesn't have THC, THCV, or THCA. Those THC ones won't have those. But it has lots of this CBD stuff. And some marijuana has a fair amount of CBD. Particular strains, especially strains that are more newly developed. A couple of those would include AC/DC, Harlequin, Charlotte's Web. Yep.
Named after that one girl that they helped in Colorado.
That's right, Charlotte Figi.
Charlotte, yeah.
Yeah. So, these little black dots on the chart represent where research is showing great promise for these cannabinoids and their ability to treat the various conditions that are listed down the side here. Now, of course, they didn't list all the conditions that have found useful effects from cannabis because the chart would be so long it would stretch down the street. But they do cover an awful lot of them, including some really big ones like pain and inflammation, like anxiety. And you'll notice that for anxiety, the only black dot is CBD. In fact, THC is not really all that great for treating anxiety. Quite a few people tell me that THC makes them actually anxious.
Or paranoid.
Yeah.
Some people get paranoid. Why is that?
Well, I think it's because they feel as though they're not completely in control.
Oh.
And, it gives you a kind of a good feeling inside to know that you're in control of things. And if you feel as though you're disoriented, you're getting what they call substance-induced psychosis, which is what THC causes, that can cause you to be anxious. And so you'll see a lot of people are looking for cannabis as a sleep aid. If your sleeplessness is associated with anxiety, really there's only one thing that's going to help quell your anxiety in cannabis, and that's the CBD part. That's what the evidence is showing anyway. If your sleeplessness is pure insomnia and has nothing much to do with anxiety, then really what you need is this CBN stuff. And that is not available as a commercial product. Nobody's selling CBN yet. Maybe someday we'll see it. And there's a tremendous need for good sleep solutions because the pharmaceuticals for sleep generally have horrific side effects.
How do you get CBN?
Quite often, yeah. CBN is actually a product of the breakdown of THC. But it's not a one-to-one ratio. So if you take a whole bunch of THC and you treat it very poorly by exposing it to heat, light, and oxygen, some portion of that THC turns into CBN. It's actually a very small portion. So it takes a lot of THC to make a little bit of CBN. And that's why nobody does it. Because the THC is so valuable and so few people know anything about CBN. I mean, you and me and your audience do, but other than that, not a lot.
Yeah.
But I expect that someday in the future, when THC becomes, we've got plenty of it because legalization has come and now people are growing marijuana everywhere. And there's tons of THC. Some of that we can use to make CBN, and that won't be a problem. So CBN is a product of the breakdown of THC. THC, of course, is the intoxicating part of marijuana. THCV is actually even more intoxicating than THC. It's a very heavy intoxicant. And you'll see it does have some, it's hard to see the black dots for THC, but here's one for appetite.
Anti-epileptic too.
Right, anti-epileptic. It's down here for bone stimulant. I think that is, yep. Now, THCV is actually something that's produced by the plant, very tiny amounts, but also in your body. So if you take an edible and it's digested, and the digested fluids from the edible go through your liver, where the liver has enzymes that work to convert molecules so that they're useful to your body. One of the actions of your liver is to convert THC to THCV. So oftentimes the thing that's actually getting people high from edibles isn't the THC, it's the THCV. And THCV is even more intoxicating than THC. So sometimes people really get whacked when they eat those edibles. Then there's THCA, and just by way of explanation, THCA is what you find in raw, fresh marijuana. If it's undried, just freshly cut marijuana, you won't find much THC, but you'll find a lot of THCA. It's the drying and warming or burning or vaporizing processes that convert the THC to THCA.
Right. You need heat.
Right. Yep, or drying.
Or drying.
Yep.
Okay.
But THCA is very, very valuable. It's not intoxicating at all, surprisingly. Won't make you feel high. But, for instance, for cancer, down here, anti-proliferative inhibits tumor cell growth. THCA is what the best research is on. So what I'd suggest for cancer patients is, as part of their cannabinoid therapy, is that they get fresh marijuana plants and pick some leaves off and throw them in a blender with some yogurt and whiz it up and drink it down. And you'll get a good dose of THCA from that. And leaves are easy to get hold of. It's the buds that everybody's looking for.
Right.
So
there's plenty of that in the
plenty
leaves?
in the leaves.
Oh.
Yeah. And fresh leaves too. Then we have the issue of cancer. So some of the most interesting science, I mean, obviously CBD for diabetes is very, very important, especially since type 2 diabetes has become so prevalent in our society. But down here again we have the anti-proliferative, reducing cancer cell growth. For that we have CBD indicated, CBC, CBG. We'll talk for a second about CBG. Where CBN is a product of the breakdown of THC, CBG is what they call a precursor cannabinoid. So most of these other cannabinoids actually come from CBG. So as CBG matures in the plant, it produces these other cannabinoids as products of its maturation. And that's what makes it a precursor. Oh. But there's some really good science on CBG being very, very valuable as a nutrient. And so we're hoping to see CBG become more available as well as these other cannabinoids. Hopefully this is helpful for people. One of the things that illustrates is that there's a lot of good research behind CBD and various medical conditions being ameliorated, helped. And there's evidence that different doses of cannabis can have different effects. So, that being said, typically for THC, your smallest doses would be on the order of maybe between 1 and 5 milligrams a day, something like that. And then still getting up to maybe 10 or so until you start getting into doses that would have more of an effect, like getting you high. When you start getting over 10 milligrams, typically that's where people would start to get that feeling of being high. A recreational user who's used to the feeling of high might even have a little tolerance, and because there is such a thing as tolerance, and I should talk about that in a second as well, could be between 10 and maybe 25 milligrams. And then a heavy, consistent user like me, I can take 25 milligrams and not even blink. I've taken up to 150 and not really had any problems with it. So
taken by smoking or
well, like a cookie or a brownie or a candy or something like an edible. The evidence is emerging, and some of the evidence is showing that different ratios of cannabinoids are better for addressing different kinds of problems. A couple of great examples of this are seizures and epilepsy, where many of the products that you find are most effective have relatively small amount of THC and a relatively large amount of CBD. Oftentimes 16 to 1, 16 parts CBD to 1 part THC, 20 to 1, something like that, in that kind of range for quelling spasms and epilepsy and things like that, seizure activities. Whereas with cancer, it seems as though the best evidence points to a 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio being most effective. And I expect that that's true for a lot of the issues that cannabinoids can deal with, is that we're going to find that there are ratios that best address various issues, and that may even vary from individual to individual, which brings up the in what my mind are interesting subjects of tolerance and of a person's individual constitution. So we have all these cannabinoids from cannabis, which are cannabis, of course, being a plant. So we call those chemicals phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids. But then within our bodies already, we have what we call endocannabinoids, internal endocannabinoids. And those are produced by our body, and they're very similar to THC and CBD and CBN. And we have receptors in our bodies that are particularly tuned to finding those chemicals in our bloodstream and allowing them to interact with our nervous and muscular systems and things like that. And those receptors are either called CB1 or CB2 receptors. And a couple of points about this is that it is probably reasonable to assume that a person's endocannabinoid system is much like any other human trait, in that you have certain people that have very strong endocannabinoid systems, robust endocannabinoid systems. And their bodies are producing plenty of endocannabinoids, and in that fashion they are a healthy person. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you probably have people whose endocannabinoid systems are deficient, whose endocannabinoid systems are very weak, and their body is craving cannabinoids, and the lack of cannabinoids is causing certain problems. And there's a name for that. It's called CECD, clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. And we're finding that there are things that are directly related to clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. And some of them include, for instance, migraine, autoimmune conditions like Crohn's, Parkinson's, things like that seem to be directly related to having a weak endocannabinoid system. It's difficult science to do, because really the only way to measure a person's endocannabinoid system is by cutting their brain open.
Oh.
And they did that on me, and it didn't work out all that well. And oh, jeez, I wish I had a brain. Then there's the issue of these receptors. So you have these CB1 and CB2 receptors. CB1 receptors have a wonderful affinity for THC, bind really hard with THC. CB2 receptors bind really hard with CBN, cannabinol. CBD doesn't really bind directly with the receptors. CBD is more kind of like a host at a restaurant. You come into the restaurant and the host says, "Oh, yes, you're dining with us this evening. How many for your table?" And you say, "I'd like a table of 2. "Oh, so you bind with the CB2 receptor. Come right this way." And that's what CBD does for stuff. It brings it to its proper receptors. It's kind of like a host in a restaurant. But it doesn't bind directly. It's an affinity, they say.
What's the difference between cannabis sativa and cannabis indica?
There are several differences. Cannabis sativa is a tropical plant, and cannabis indica is from the temperate region, above the tropical regions or below the tropical regions. So the tropical region is at the equator and either below 30 degrees north or above 30 degrees south latitude. So it's fairly close to the equator. That's the tropics. Plants that grow in the tropics experience very strong sunlight and less rain. Plants either above that, in another band between the tropics and the subarctic region, that's called the temperate zone. And there's a temperate zone north of the equator and a temperate zone south of the equator. And that's where the US and Europe and all those places are. Those temperate zones had a native kind of cannabis that was different than the tropical cannabis in a couple of ways. The temperate zone cannabis was a much shorter plant, generally grew only to be about 5 or 6 feet tall. Much bushier plant, a lot of branching.
That's the indica?
And wide leaves. So cannabis leaf is made up of leaf petals, and a cannabis leaf can have anywhere from 1 to maybe 7 or 8 petals on a leaf. And those petals can be either very narrow or relatively wide. And the difference is the amount of sunlight it gets. So if it's a tropical type of cannabis, it's going to have a narrow leaf because the sun is so much stronger in the tropics that it doesn't need all that leaf surface to produce the sugars the plant uses to grow. It can have a much narrower leaf and still produce plenty of sugars because there's so much strong sunlight. The other point to that is that the tropics being hotter and drier, the wider your plant leaflet is, the more evaporation you'll have, and the more quickly the plant will dry out. So near the equator, another reason that the leaflets are very narrow is so that they don't evaporate quite as much water, and the plant doesn't dry out quite so quickly. In the temperate zone, you get plenty of rain and not quite as much sunshine. So both of those things stimulate the plant to have a wider leaf. Now, that being said, there's a lot of stock put into the idea that indicas and sativas are different from each other, medically different in some fashion.
Right, there's supposed to be different effects for
Right,
each of
and
them.
typically what you hear is that indicas make people tired, they give them couch lock, they make them relatively unmotivated, and sativas are an uplifting high, the kind of high that makes you energetic and makes you want to go out and do things and have fun and stuff like that. And it's a great idea. It's very attractive because it makes things so simple. You know, oh, this one for daytime and this one for nighttime,
Right.
and it's so easy because we do this. But the truth is that it's probably just a lot of hooey.
I was wondering because I don't seem to notice much difference.
No. And really the difference is, there are differences between strains and the way they make you feel.
When in the tastes.
The tastes, the terpenes, the terpene value, and to some degree the cannabinoid value as well. But let me show you a little chart and tell you about a series of experiments. So I work very closely with MCR Labs right there, and they've done hundreds of samples of all kinds of cannabis products for me. In fact, it may be so many hundreds of samples that I'm over 1,000 now. I'm not really sure how many samples I've had tested there, but many, many, many samples. And I'm not alone. There are many other people who've had samples there as well. And MCR Labs, as part of their research work, they agglomerate the data from all the samples they test. You can't have individually identifiable information on the agglomerated data. You have to take away where the sample came from and who paid for it and all that stuff. They just have the test results on the cannabis. And then they look up on Leafly or some other guide to find out whether that strain of cannabis is considered either an indica or a sativa. And the assumption was that because people believed that indicas were more calming, that they would have a higher level of CBD. And that since sativas didn't have that calming factor, they would have a lower level of CBD, or that the THC levels were different. Maybe sativa has more THC, so it's more enervating. So they tested literally thousands of samples of indicas and sativas, expecting that they'd find a grouping where the indicas are kind of all together up here and the sativas are all together down here. But they found just the opposite. The indicas being in red dots, I think, is that what they say? Yeah, indicas the red dots and sativas the green dots. And if you look at the chart for red and green dots,
They're all together.
you notice it's a complete miasma. There's no rhyme or reason to it at all. So this idea that indicas are one way and sativas are another way probably does not hold water scientifically. Beyond that, then there's the whole idea of a particular strain having a particular capacity or a particular way of working, and even that is subject to disbelief.